The sun had barely begun its descent behind the jagged mesas when Liora Sinclair pulled her horse to a halt. Dust swirled around her boots as she surveyed the desolate canyon below, the wind carrying the faint smell of sage and the acrid tongue of smoke from distant campfires. She was 30, strong in body but weary in spirit, her chest tight from the years of hardship that had chased her across the Western Territories. Every mile of open land seemed to remind her that life was never gentle, only fleeting moments of reprieve existed between the relentless trials. She dismounted, her fingers brushing over the worn leather of her saddlebags. Inside lay what little she had managed to keep: a revolver, a small knife, and a bundle of papers with hastily scrawled notes, hopes, dreams, and fragments of a life she'd almost lost. But those treasures felt trivial now, overshadowed by the shadow that lurked at the edge of the canyon, watching her with eyes as dark and sharp as obsidian. He emerged from the rocks like a phantom, broad-shouldered, with long black hair braided. Against his tanned, scarred skin, the Apache warrior moved with a quiet authority that made the desert itself seem to hold its breath. His name was Kanoa Redhawk, and Liora knew of him not by choice, but by whispered warnings in every settlement she had passed. He was a ghost to many, a force that appeared where danger lurked and disappeared before anyone could speak of him. Liora tightened her cloak around her shoulders as he approached, the solace of his moccasins barely making a sound on the rocky ground. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low but commanding, like the river cutting through the canyon's depths. "This place is dangerous for those who walk alone." "I can handle myself," Liora replied, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. She had spent too many nights running from men and storms, from predators both human and wild, to admit fear outright. Kanoa's gaze swept over her like the wind, assessing, calculating. "Perhaps," he said, "but strength alone does not keep a woman alive out here." Leora's hand twitched toward her revolver, but Kanoa didn't move to threaten her. Instead, he tilted his head, as though listening to a song only he could hear. The silence stretched between them, tense and charged, until it was broken by the distant scream of a hawk overhead. "You're bleeding," he said abruptly, his eyes narrowing. Her chest tightened, and for a moment she hesitated. The pain had been there all day, a dull, gnawing ache that deepened with every step. She had fallen earlier, tripping over a jagged rock, and had thought little of it. But now, with Kanoa's sharp gaze on her, the truth could not be hidden. She inhaled slowly. "It's nothing," she whispered, but the words felt hollow. "Just a scratch." "You're lying," he said, taking a step closer. The wind carried the faint scent of leather and smoke from his body. "My people, my eyes see truth where others only see pretense." Leora's vision blurred. She pressed her hand to her side, feeling the wet warmth of blood seeping between her fingers. "My ribs, they're already broken," she whispered, the words tasting like ash on her tongue. Pain shot through her torso with every breath, sharp and unforgiving. She wanted to collapse, to surrender to the agony, but she forced herself upright. Kanoa's eyes darkened, but he did not rush to help her. Instead, he stepped back, his silhouette framed by the dying light. "Then you will walk alone," he said, his voice almost gentle. "I cannot follow where you choose to carry your own burden." The desert seemed to shift around her, the shadows growing longer, swallowing the canyon floor. Liora stared at him, anger and fear warring within her. How could he leave her here, bleeding and defenseless? And yet, beneath the surface, she felt the echo of something else, something she could not name. A strange respect, perhaps, or a warning she could not yet understand. Kanoa turned his back to her and vanished into the rocks, moving as silently as he had appeared, leaving Liora alone in the canyon. She sank to her knees, her breath shallow and ragged. Every sound seemed magnified: the creak of her saddle, the whistle of the wind, the distant howl of coyotes, And somewhere deep in the shadows, unseen but undeniably present, the feeling lingered. She was not yet done. The Apache had left her to face the pain, but she would not yield, not yet. Somewhere in the heart of the wilderness, her fight had just begun. Liora Sinclair stayed on her knees longer than she intended, the jagged rock pressing into her legs, her breath shallow and uneven. Blood seeped through her blouse, dark and hot, leaving a trail on the dust-strewn canyon floor. The wind whispered across the cliffs, carrying the dry scent of sage and the faint echo of her own ragged heartbeat. Pain radiated through her chest with every movement, but a stubborn fire burned inside her. She refused to yield, refused to let the canyon claim her like so many others it had swallowed over the years. With shaking hands, she reached for her revolver, but it slipped from her fingers, landing several inches away in the dust. Swearing softly under her breath, she crawled toward it, each inch a battle against the agony in her ribs. The shadow of Kanoa Redhawk loomed across the canyon rim again, a silent silhouette etched against the fading light. She could barely look at him without feeling a mix of anger, fear, and something else, something that stirred deep within her, unacknowledged and confusing. He had left her here, knowing she was injured. Yet she could sense his presence like a pulse in the air, close but just beyond reach. "You shouldn't be here," Kanoa's voice cut through the wind, calm but loaded with an unshakable authority. He stepped down the slope toward her, his bare chest glistening faintly in the sun's dying glow, the tribal jewelry around his neck and wrists catching the light with every movement. Muscles flexed under tanned, scarred skin, evidence of years surviving the unforgiving land. But his eyes held something deeper, an unreadable mixture of respect, warning, and something almost human. Liora pulled herself upright as best she could, clutching her side. "I said I'm fine," she whispered, though the words came out harsh and brittle. She wanted to hide the pain, to prove she could endure without his help. Pride had always been her armor, and she wasn't about to lower it now. Kanoa stopped a few feet away, his gaze sharp, unyielding. "You lie to yourself," he said quietly. "The desert sees the truth, Liora. Your body does not hide it. And neither will I." Her stomach twisted at the sound of her name on his lips. How did he know? How did he see through her defenses so easily? For a fleeting moment, she felt exposed, vulnerable, yet strangely seen. But the pain in her ribs brought her back sharply to reality. "Then leave," she snapped, her voice cracking. "If you truly care about the truth, leave me to die in peace." Kanoa's lips pressed into a thin line, his dark eyes never leaving her face. For a heartbeat, the canyon seemed to fall silent. And then he crouched, careful and deliberate, as though he weighed every action against her fragile state. "I do not leave," he said simply. Leora's chest tightened again, sharper this time, the reminder of broken bones searing through her. "Why?" she asked, the word barely a whisper. "Why care at all?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he extended a hand, not to grab her forcibly, but as an offer, an unspoken contract between survival and trust. "Because you are alive, and the desert does not belong to those who surrender," Kanoa said. His voice carried the weight of truth, a quiet certainty that filled the canyon like the wind itself. Swallowing the pain, Liora hesitated. She wanted to refuse, to prove that she could survive without him, but exhaustion and the ache in her ribs betrayed her stubbornness. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, comforting, yet it spoke of control, not indulgence. Step by step, he helped her across the rocky terrain. Each movement was careful, deliberate, forcing her to lean on him more than she wanted. She could feel the heat from his body, the faint scent of smoke and leather, the quiet power that radiated from him like the sun baking the desert floor. "You should rest," Kanoa said finally. guiding her toward a narrow alcove in the canyon wall, shaded from the last rays of sun. The night will be cold, and the desert shows no mercy. Liora sank to the ground, clutching her side. For the first time in years, she let her pride slip just enough to allow herself to lean into his presence. He did not rush her, did not demand words. He simply knelt beside her, alert, silent, as though guarding more than her body guarding the fragile ember of her will. The canyon grew darker, the wind whispering through the crevices like a chorus of unseen voices. And somewhere, in the depth of that silence, Liora realized the painful truth. She might not survive the night. But if she did, Kanoa Redhawk would be the shadow at her side, relentless, watchful, and impossible to ignore. Night fell over the canyon like a heavy curtain, swallowing the mesas and turning the desert floor into a sea of black and silver moonlight. Liora Sinclair shivered despite the thin blanket Kanoa Redhawk had offered her. Her ribs screamed with every shallow breath, each inhale a knife's edge pressing into her chest. She pressed her hand to the aching wound, wincing as the pain radiated down her side. The world around her felt surreal, the stars bright and distant, the wind whispering secrets through the canyon walls. Kanoa remained a few feet away, crouched beside the fire he had built. His muscular frame glowed faintly in the flickering light, the tribal jewelry around his neck and wrists catching the flames in subtle flashes. The fire illuminated his sharp features, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that burned with intensity, both fierce and calculating. Despite the tension that lingered between them, he moved with an ease and grace that seemed almost unnatural. Every motion radiated control, a silent assertion of power that contrasted with Liora's fragile, wounded state. "You shouldn't have wandered here alone," Kanoa said quietly, his gaze fixed on the fire. His tone was calm, but it carried the weight of command, and Liora felt it sink deep into her chest. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered, her voice ragged from pain and exhaustion. "I had to leave the town. They wouldn't understand. They never do." Her words faltered, almost swallowed by the wind. She hated showing weakness, yet it came unbidden, spilling out in fragments, trembling and raw. Kanoa's eyes softened fractionally, though he made no move to approach her. "I understand more than you know," he said. "Pain doesn't belong only to the body, Liora. It settles in the soul, and it can kill a person as surely as a blade." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to look at him. His intensity was suffocating yet magnetic. Something about him demanded attention, respect, and perhaps, if she allowed herself to admit it, trust. But trust was dangerous. Trust could get her killed, and yet she could feel the faint warmth of safety radiating from his presence. A shield she wasn't sure she deserved. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional cry of a distant coyote. Liora tried to shift, hoping to ease the pain in her ribs, but a sharp spike of agony shot through her side, forcing a gasp from her lips. Kanoa's head snapped toward her immediately, eyes narrowing. "You're worse than you let on," he said, his voice low but firm. Before she could protest, he had moved to her side, his large hands firm on her shoulders, steadying her. "I warned you, but you refused to listen. Now you pay the price." "I can manage," Liora whispered, though the lie sounded feeble even to her own ears. Kanoa's dark gaze pierced her, and she felt herself falter under the weight of it. He studied her for long moments, his sharp eyes scanning her injuries, her posture, her every motion. Then, with deliberate care, he pressed a hand to her side, palpating the area with a mix of urgency and precision. "You can't walk far like this. You need rest, medicine, and time. The desert doesn't forgive weakness, but it does reward those who survive it." Liora's chest tightened, not just from pain, but from something else she couldn't name. A strange mixture of vulnerability and defiance welled within her. "I don't need pity," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "I just need to survive." Kanoa's expression hardened slightly, and he moved to the small fire again, pulling a leather pouch from his belt. He opened it with care, revealing dried herbs, salves, and strips of cloth. "Then survive," he said simply. "I'll help you, but only because the desert has decided your story isn't finished yet." As he worked to clean and bind her wound, Liora felt a flicker of something dangerous. Relief, yes, but also a hesitant connection. The man who had left her alone in the canyon earlier was now tending to her with unyielding focus. His hands were strong and certain, his movements methodical. She hated herself for noticing the heat in his touch, the quiet power in his presence, but she couldn't deny it. Night deepened, and the fire flickered, casting shadows across the canyon walls. Somewhere in the darkness, the wind whispered secrets she could not yet understand. Kanoa sat beside her, vigilant, silent, and unwavering. And Liora realized with a sudden clarity that the desert was no longer just a place of death and pain, it was a crucible. And Kanoa Redhawk, enigmatic and unrelenting, was the storm she would have to face. The night pressed in around them, tense, intimate, and dangerous. And somewhere between the pain, the shadows, and the firelight, Liora understood one painful truth. Survival in this harsh land would demand more than courage. It would demand surrender to the desert, to the pain, and perhaps, unwillingly, to the man who had left her to suffer but had returned to hold her through it. Dawn crept over the canyon, painting the jagged cliffs in muted shades of gold and crimson. Liora Sinclair stirred, the ache in her ribs a constant reminder of yesterday's fall, of Kanoa Redhawk's reluctant help. Her body was weak, but her mind refused surrender. She could feel the desert around her waking, the wind carrying the scent of sage, dust, and distant pine. And she knew the vast wilderness would not forgive any lapse in vigilance. Kanoa sat a few feet away, his back straight, eyes scanning the horizon with a quiet intensity. The flickering embers of the small fire they had kept burning overnight were reduced to gray ash, and the wind tugged at his long black hair, sweeping it across his tanned, scarred chest. The tribal jewelry around his neck and wrists shimmered faintly in the early light, an intricate testament to his heritage and the battles he had endured. Though silent, his presence was a force that pressed into the canyon like the rising sun itself, unyielding, uncompromising, and impossible to ignore. "You need to move carefully today," Kanoa said finally, his voice low, measured. He had been quiet since tending her wounds, speaking only when necessary. "The canyon is dangerous at this hour. Wild animals, loose rocks, and men who hunt for trouble." "I can manage," Liora said, though the words came slower than intended. Her breath was shallow, each inhale sending sharp jolts of pain through her ribs. "I've survived worse." He studied her for a long moment, the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth betraying a hint of skepticism. "Perhaps," he said, "but survival is more than stubbornness. It is knowing when to rely on another, even when pride tells you otherwise." Leora's eyes met his, the stubborn fire in them refusing to bow. "I don't need your lessons," she said quietly, though a part of her, the part she refused to admit, hung on his words. Her pride was a fortress, but the desert had begun to erode its walls. The morning was still, almost oppressive in its quiet. The canyon seemed alive, every rock and crevice holding its own secrets. Liora tested herself on the uneven ground, each step sending shocks through her side. Kanoa's eyes followed her, sharp and unrelenting, as though he could read each pain, each hesitation. Like an open map of her body. "You're worse than I imagined," he murmured, his voice carrying a weight she could feel more than hear. He stepped closer, and despite the heat of the sun, the proximity made her skin tingle. He did not touch her, not yet, but the force of his presence was undeniable. "I can endure," Liora whispered, grit lining her tone. She wanted to show him strength, to prove she was more than a wounded woman on the canyon floor. Kanoa's gaze softened imperceptibly, though the sharp edge never left his eyes. "Endurance is not proof of strength," he said, kneeling beside her. "Strength is knowing when to preserve yourself, when to survive for the battles ahead, not just the ones behind you." She wanted to argue, but the words lodged in her throat. Pain, exhaustion, and a strange, unnameable tension held her captive. She felt vulnerable in a way she had never allowed herself to feel, yet Kanoa's presence was oddly grounding. There was a strange rhythm to his movements, precise and deliberate, like a predator assessing a prey not with malice, but with calculated care. A sudden sound, a distant rustle, sharp and unexpected, made Liora stiffen. Kanoa's head snapped toward the canyon rim, eyes narrowing, muscles taut and ready. The danger passed as quickly as it had come, but the tension remained, a silent reminder that this land offered no reprieve. "You're not safe here alone," Kanoa said, voice low, almost a growl. "And yet, you insist on testing the canyon anyway." Leora's lips pressed into a thin line, her pride warring with her pain. "I've never been safe anywhere," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "And I won't start pretending now." Kanoa's expression darkened, unreadable yet fierce. He rose to his full height, chest heaving lightly as the desert wind brushed against him. "Then survive," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But remember this, Liora Sinclair, the canyon does not forgive mistakes, and neither do I." As the morning sun climbed higher, Liora felt a shiver of both fear and exhilaration. She was alone with her pain, yet not entirely alone. Kanoa Redhawk, enigmatic and untamed, was there watching, guiding, and challenging her in ways she could neither ignore nor fully understand. The canyon stretched endlessly around them, full of shadows and secrets, and somewhere deep within its heart, Liora knew her true test was only beginning. The afternoon sun scorched the canyon floor, and the shadows of the jagged cliffs stretched long across the dust-strewn ground. Liora Sinclair moved slowly, each step sending fresh stabs of pain through her ribs. Her clothes were torn, dust-streaked, and soaked with sweat and blood, but she refused to collapse. Survival demanded more than surrender, and she would not give the desert the satisfaction. Kanoa Redhawk followed silently, his muscular frame a constant presence just behind her. Shirtless, his long black hair whipped in the dry wind, and the beads, feathers, and leather strips of his tribal jewelry caught the sunlight, glinting like tiny flames. He had said nothing for hours, letting Liora struggle under her own strength, letting her prove her will, but he remained vigilant, scanning every cliff and crevice as though the canyon itself might attack. A sudden noise, a sharp crack of snapping wood, echoed through the canyon. Liora froze, heart hammering, and Kanoa immediately pivoted toward the source. His eyes, dark and calculating, narrowed. He crouched slightly, every muscle taut, a predator ready to strike. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the air. Liora obeyed instinctively, moving closer despite the burning pain in her side. From behind a boulder, 3 men emerged, rough and ragged, with the unmistakable look of bounty hunters or worse, opportunists seeking prey in the lawless desert. Their eyes widened at the sight of Kanoa, but not enough to stop them. One of them sneered at Liora. Well, looks like we found ourselves a little lady all alone. Hand over your valuables, lady, and maybe we won't hurt you." Leora's blood ran cold, but she refused to show fear. She drew herself up as best she could, despite the pain. "I'm not alone," she said through gritted teeth. The sneer faltered as Kanoa stepped forward. The muscles in his arms and chest flexed under the sun, and the tribal jewelry jingled faintly with the movement. His presence alone shifted the balance of the encounter. "Leave her," he said, voice low, deadly, and absolute. The men laughed nervously. "And if we don't?" one of them challenged. Kanoa's eyes darkened, and his expression hardened. In a blur of motion, he moved like a storm unleashed. His hand shot out, grabbing the nearest man's wrist and twisting it with inhuman strength. The man yelped, dropping his gun, and stumbled backward into the canyon wall. The second man lunged, and Kanoa intercepted him with a sweeping motion, sending him sprawling across the dust. The last man hesitated, fear finally breaking through his bravado. Leora's breath caught in her throat. She had seen Kanoa's strength before, but this was something primal, terrifying, and yet protective. He did not strike out of anger, but out of necessity, a controlled force of survival and dominance. The men fled, scrambling up the canyon walls, leaving their weapons behind. Kanoa didn't chase them, simply standing tall, every sinew coiled with energy, his gaze still fixed on the canyon's shadows. Liora sank to the ground, her body trembling from exhaustion, fear, and the lingering pain in her ribs. Kanoa knelt beside her without a word, his hand hovering near her shoulder, cautious, protective. "You're pushing yourself too far," he said softly, his voice carrying that strange mix of authority and something almost gentle. "I have to keep moving," Liora whispered, shaking her head. Pride burned hotter than the desert sun. "I won't be helpless." "You are not helpless," Kanoa replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "But you are mortal. And the canyon? It has no mercy for those who pretend otherwise." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft whistle of wind through the canyon and the distant cry of a hawk. Liora looked up at him, trying to reconcile the man who had left her alone in pain with the one who had now saved her life. Effortlessly and decisively. "I don't know why you care," she admitted quietly, her voice trembling. "You left me yesterday, and yet—" Kanoa's dark gaze softened slightly. "I care because the desert has chosen to keep you alive for a reason," he said, "and because leaving you to die would serve neither my honor nor the truth I follow." Liora exhaled slowly, letting herself feel a fraction of relief. She hated the vulnerability, but she could not deny the gratitude and something else, a connection she had tried to resist. The canyon was dangerous, brutal and full of secrets, yet in that moment, with Kanoa Redhawk beside her, she felt a fragile thread of hope that the desert stretched endlessly around them, hot, unforgiving, and mysterious. And Liora realized with a mix of dread and determination that surviving it would require more than just willpower. It would demand trust, resilience, and perhaps, whether she wanted it or not, surrender to the enigmatic man who had saved her from the brink of death. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, turning the canyon into a labyrinth of gold and shadow. Liora Sinclair sat against a jagged rock, her ribs throbbing with every breath, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon. The desert had a cruel way of magnifying every fear, every weakness, and she knew that tonight could be as merciless as the day that had nearly claimed her life. Kanoa Redhawk stood a few feet away, shirtless, his muscular form gleaming with sweat, the tribal jewelry around his wrists and neck catching the fading light. He was a sentinel, a storm coiled in human form, his eyes dark and unwavering. For hours he had not spoken, yet his presence filled the canyon with a tension that was almost tangible. Liora felt it in every nerve, every pulse of her bruised body. "You're tiring yourself," he said finally, his voice low and steady, breaking the silence without disturbing its weight. "I have to keep moving," Liora replied, her voice strained. "If I stay here, the canyon might finish what it started." Kanoa's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze scanning the rocky horizon. "The canyon isn't your enemy," he said. "It's the men who use it to hide their intentions. And they are close." Leora's chest tightened at his words, the sharp reminder of yesterday's encounter with the bounty hunters still fresh in her memory. She had survived, but she knew they would return if they sensed weakness. The desert was unforgiving, but humans were far more dangerous. He crouched beside her, careful and deliberate. "There is a place," he said, "where you can rest. Where the canyon secrets will shield you, at least for a while." Leora glanced at him, wary. "Why help me?" she asked, voice tight. "You could leave like yesterday. You don't owe me anything." Kanoa's expression softened just slightly, enough that she caught a flicker of something human behind the stoic exterior. "I owe no one," he said. "But leaving you to die for no reason, that would dishonor me. And you, Liora Sinclair, are not meant to die here." Her heart thumped violently. She didn't understand this man, this mysterious, untamed warrior who had appeared out of nowhere, saved her life, and yet demanded nothing in return. And now he spoke with an intensity that felt like a promise or a warning. He led her across the canyon floor, each step careful, deliberate. Leora leaned heavily on him, grateful for the strength he offered, yet resisting the vulnerability it forced upon her. Pain shot through her ribs with every movement, but Kanoa's presence lent her courage she hadn't known she possessed. At last, they arrived at a narrow alcove hidden behind a cluster of jagged rocks. The setting sun cast deep shadows, rendering the space nearly invisible to anyone passing by. Leora sank to the ground, exhausted, her body trembling. "You'll be safe here," Kanoa said, scanning the surroundings for threats. "For now." He settled a few feet away, his eyes never leaving the canyon's edges. "Rest, heal, and listen. The desert speaks to those who survive it." Leora swallowed, leaning back against the cool rock. "The desert speaks?" she asked, her voice weak. "Yes," he said quietly. "In silence, in shadows, in the way the wind carries stories. If you learn to hear it, it will protect you. If you ignore it, it will consume you." A long silence fell, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk and the whisper of wind through the canyon. Leora watched Kanoa, his muscles relaxed but alert, his dark eyes scanning for danger even in the moment of calm. She felt the weight of his presence, the unspoken bond forming between them, fragile yet undeniable. "Why me?" she whispered finally, more to herself than to him. "Why now? Why save me?" Kanoa's gaze met hers, steady, unwavering. "Because you survived," he said, "and those who survive are meant to witness what comes next. The canyon has secrets, Leora, and you are part of them now." Her chest ached, both from her broken ribs and the truth of his words. Fear, gratitude, and something else, a flicker of something she couldn't yet name, warred within her. She realized that her journey, her fight for survival, had become entwined with this enigmatic warrior. The canyon was no longer just a place of danger. It was a crucible, and Kanoa Redhawk was both its guardian and its storm. As night fell fully, the shadows deepened, and the desert's secrets whispered through the jagged rocks. Leora closed her eyes, leaning back against the stone, and allowed herself, briefly, to rest. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she knew she would not face it alone. The canyon was silent now, save for the whispering wind that carried the scent of dust and sage. Liora Sinclair leaned against a jagged rock, her ribs throbbing with every breath, yet a strange calm had settled over her. The days of struggle, the fall, the pain, the near-death encounters had led her here. To the edge of the canyon where the land dropped away into endless shadow and light, Kanoa Redhawk stood a few feet away. his shirtless, muscular frame outlined against the fading orange and red sky. The tribal jewelry on his wrists and neck caught the last rays of sunlight, glinting like embers. His long black hair whipped slightly in the desert breeze, yet his posture remained unyielding, a sentinel carved from the canyon itself. There was no hint of vulnerability in him. He was the storm and the calm, the danger and the protection, all at once. "You've come far," Kanoa said quietly, his voice low, resonant. It carried the weight of judgment and respect, a recognition of her endurance. "Farther than most would dare." Liora exhaled slowly, wincing as the pain in her ribs reminded her of yesterday's struggle. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered, eyes on the jagged horizon. "I had to survive. I couldn't let this place take me." "You did survive," Kanoa said, stepping closer, the dust swirling around his feet like ghostly trails. "But survival is only the beginning, Liora. What comes next is the hardest part." Her gaze lifted to meet his. Searching, defiant, yet tinged with something softer, a question unspoken. A vulnerability she rarely allowed anyone to see. "And what comes next?" she asked, her voice quivering slightly, betraying the exhaustion that had been masked by stubborn pride. Kanoa's dark eyes softened, though the intensity never left them. He knelt beside her, careful and deliberate, his fingers brushing a lock of dust-streaked hair from her face. "You choose," he said. "You decide whether the canyon shapes you, or you shape your destiny." For a long moment, Liora stared at him, the fire of frustration, pain, and unspoken longing swirling in her chest. She wanted to push him away, to stand on her own. And yet, the raw honesty in his gaze, the strength in his hands, the unwavering presence, it was impossible to resist. She began, but the words faltered. Pride and fear collided in her chest, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to simply breathe, to acknowledge the truth she had tried to ignore. The canyon had tested her, broken her, and yet in its harshest trials, it had brought her to him. Kanoa extended his hand, steady and commanding, yet gentle. "Then rise, Liora Sinclair. Rise with me. The canyon has spared you for a reason. Do not waste it." She hesitated, pain shooting through her side, but slowly placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, unwavering, a silent promise that she would not face the darkness alone. Together they rose to stand, the canyon stretching endlessly around them, full of shadow and light, danger and beauty. A gust of wind swept through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Kanoa's eyes scanned the horizon, alert, unyielding. And yet, when they met hers again, there was a rare softness, a recognition of shared endurance, of battles fought and survived. "You've changed," he murmured. Almost to himself, yet she heard it clearly. "The canyon would have consumed most. You adapted." "I had to," Liora said, her voice steady now, strengthened by survival and by the strange bond forming between them. "And I had help." She looked at him, gratitude, frustration, and a spark of something more flickering in her eyes. Kanoa inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her words, but he said nothing. Words had little power compared to the silence between them, the unspoken understanding that they were both survivors of the canyon's trials. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the jagged cliffs. Liora felt the ache in her ribs and the weariness in her body, yet a fierce clarity had taken root in her chest. She had survived the desert, endured the pain, and faced the storm both in the land and in the enigmatic man beside her dot, and as the last rays of sunlight painted the canyon in gold and crimson. Liora Sinclair understood that she was no longer just a survivor. She was a woman who had faced the unforgiving wilderness, who had been tested by pain and fear, and who now stood at the edge of a new beginning. Kanoa stepped closer, his dark eyes meeting hers once more. The canyon was vast, mysterious, and dangerous, but in that moment, she realized they had both found something rare, an unspoken alliance forged in blood, struggle, and the desert's relentless trials. The wind whispered through the cliffs, carrying secrets and shadows alike. And together, Liora Sinclair and Kanoa Redhawk stepped forward, not just into the canyon, but into the unknown, stronger for the pain endured and the bond formed, a bond that would endure far beyond the harsh desert that had tried to break them. The canyon was silent again, but the story of survival, trust, and unspoken connection remained, written into the shadows and the sunset, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another.